Right. Thank you so much, Shoshana, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ann Outlaw. I'm your host, and I'm the dissemination lead at the Knowledge Translation for Employment Research Center, or the CATER Center, which is housed at the American Institutes for Research, and we're funded by the National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR. I'd like to thank my colleagues here, Shoshana Rabinovsky and Ariana Hammersmith, for their support today, and of course to our presenter, Melanie Barwick. Today, we'll focus on how best to articulate your knowledge translation, or KT plan, and the KT Planning Template Companion tool that was developed solely for this purpose. Throughout this session, use a chat box to ask all of your questions, and we'll respond to them accordingly. And joining us today, of course, is Dr. Melanie Barwick. She is a psychologist and senior scientist at the Sick Kids Research Institute, as well as a professor at the University of Toronto. She is also the associate editor for the journal Evidence and Policy, and on the editorial board of a new journal, Implementation Research and Practice. She has developed many KT and implementation tools in her career, many of which I've used and really enjoy. So thank you for those, Melanie. And we're very pleased to have you join us today.
Thank you. So I will share my screen, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to run you through this tool. So here we go. And just to clarify, Anne, you're going to let me know if there's any questions to answer along the way?
I sure will. Yep, I'll be monitoring them as we go.
Perfect. Perfect. So I'm going to be talking about the companion tool. And before I start doing that, it is a companion tool for another tool called the Knowledge Translation Planning Template. So I'm going to briefly summarize the core components of the Knowledge Translation Planning Template, just to refresh your memories or introduce you to it anew if you have not seen it before. One of the things we know is that success in research funding and research more generally is often realized through effective dissemination of research findings. And so the KTPT and the companion tool were developed to really enable this to happen in a more structured way, in a more effective way, to support the planning process. And in the many years that I have facilitated workshops, and plenty of workshops around the planning tool, people have articulated to me that they often struggle with completing the planning tool and then having to translate it, essentially bring it from a logic model format into either a prose format or some sort of structured format that's requested by the funding opportunity. So this companion tool is really an effort to try and facilitate that transition from one tool to where your plan might need to actually live. So I developed the companion tool with that in mind. So the Knowledge Translation Planning Template is several pages long. It's available on the web. It's available through CATER as well in a link. And it essentially lays out 13 core components of effective KT planning, starting with who are the project partners, how are you engaging with those project partners, what are their roles, so kind of trying to capture what your project partners may be saying to you in letters of support that you would be including with your proposal. What sort of knowledge translation expertise might you need as you conduct this work? So is that another scientist? Is that a consultant, a knowledge broker? That may not be a familiar term to you, but somebody who's going to support that knowledge translation process. Might be an individual, or it might be through a partnership with another organization that has those sorts of supports built in. So you're trying to identify the expertise that you need on hand. As you move through the template, you will identify who your knowledge users are. So ask yourself, who's going to benefit from this research if it were to be funded? Which knowledge users or audiences am I going to target? And there's a list here. It's not an exhaustive list. You certainly can specify other knowledge users that are not on the list. And a little note at the bottom, if you can see it, have you included any of your knowledge users on the project team? So I think of the project team and the knowledge users as a Venn diagram of intersecting circles. Some of your knowledge users will be useful to you as project team members, but not all of them. The next column in the middle asks you to consider what the main messages might be. So what do you think your overarching main message might be? And what main messages do you anticipate sharing with, say, the top 3 knowledge user audiences that you've developed? And sometimes you just don't know, which is fine, but you can at least describe in your plan that through engagement with your knowledge users, you will co-develop these main messages so that they resonate with the needs of the knowledge user audience that you are identifying. As you're thinking about who your knowledge users are and what the main message is for that knowledge user, you also need to align that with, why am I telling this group of people this particular main message? And this is the knowledge translation goals. And it's surprisingly very often skipped over. We think about our project at the completion, what we think we learned and what we want to share, but very often we don't consider, why are we sharing this message? Do we want to generate awareness or interest or buy-in? Are we simply sharing knowledge, evidence-based knowledge? Are we trying to inform decision-making or research in some way? Are we doing this dissemination as part and parcel of a larger plan to facilitate policy change or practice or behavior change, or even technology pathway? And it's really important to think about the why you are communicating something. As you move through, you're then going to pick your strategies. So if you know who you're communicating with, what you want to tell them, and why you're communicating with them, you then will map that onto knowledge translation strategies that should hopefully accomplish that task. And these are organized into different sections that map onto knowledge translation goals. So if your goal is to generate awareness, interest, or buy-in, etc., there's a range of strategies that you see on the left. If your goal is to inform research, there are strategies in the middle. If your goal is to facilitate policy change or commercialization, this is a little bit cut off at the bottom, but you will see some strategies listed in the right column that address those particular goals. One important point here is that the knowledge translation planning template is about dissemination of evidence. It is not a tool for implementation of evidence. Two separate things, related, yes, but you have dissemination and implementation. So if you want to facilitate practice and behavior change, you're probably doing one of these other goals first, creating awareness and buy-in and sharing knowledge, and then you'll be moving to developing an implementation plan. And I also have a tool for that, but that's not the focus of today's discussion. So just to remind you, dissemination versus implementation. This is a dissemination planning tool, so it's about diffusion, dissemination, but not the application of processes and strategies that actually encourage change. For that, I would refer you to the implementation game on my website. Oops, wrong direction, here we go. So you want to maybe perhaps identify your knowledge translation approach or your process. In Canada, we have a very clear distinction between integrated knowledge translation and end-of-grant knowledge translation. Integrated knowledge translation reflects the knowledge translation and communication of evidence activities that occur during the conduct of your research, before, during, and after, whereas end-of-grant activities are your knowledge translation tasks that you undertake once your project is completed. Because you have identified a knowledge user, a main message, a purpose, and strategies that map to that purpose, it really is important for you to ask, did we achieve that knowledge translation goal? And you can use a range of different indicators to answer that sort of question. who actually accessed our knowledge translation deliverable, how useful did they find it, how are they intending to use it, did we develop effective partnerships or collaborations, and so on. And so these are some guiding questions in column 10 about how you will know your KT activities goals have been achieved, and your guiding questions for evaluation. Lastly, what resources, budget items do you need? And then a place to start to write your procedures. How are you going to put your knowledge translation plan into action? So that's the KTPT. The problem, as I mentioned in the opening of this webinar, is that having completed this, you then have to wrap your head around how to describe your plan to the grant reviewer in the format that they want and in the space provided. And as you know, we've increasingly gone from, free-form proposals that it might include this as a section to structured web-based forms that we have to fill in, which oftentimes are a little bit tighter in terms of the room afforded to us to tell a story. So turning your logic model into prose often leads to the problem of poor comprehensiveness. So you miss some of the tasks that you should be doing that I've identified as a core KT element. Or you don't have alignment, and I'll talk a bit more about alignment, but essentially it's that notion of what message, for whom, why, how, and with what impact. Because your messages are tailored to particular knowledge user audiences with particular goals in mind that map to particular strategies and evaluation metrics. You might have a different stream running for different knowledge users. And so it's important to reflect that in the knowledge translation plan and the story that you tell. So here's the knowledge translation planning template. Again, it's available to you for free. And it's laid out in three general sections. The first is, being able to articulate what you think your main message is going to be for your general research approach. And, true to form in COVID world at the moment, I noticed that the tense of this sentence made it sound as though you already had your findings, and I couldn't access the original version to change it because I'm at home. So the opening sentence really sets the stage by describing what you hope your overall findings of the study or project will be. Oops, sorry, going the wrong way. The next section asks you to describe in what way, if any, does your project integrate knowledge translation activities. So one of the things that I have seen in lots of different research proposals and in the workshops where I've helped people develop knowledge translation plans is that most descriptions of integrated knowledge translation, which I call IKT, describe the knowledge users, and they might say a little bit about how they might be involved, but overall they say very little about the process or the intent. And so your approach, we recognize that your approach to all of your knowledge translation is going to evolve as your project unfolds, and you may not have a clear picture right at the outset, and that's okay. But in this section, if you are working with knowledge users, you want to be describing how they're going to work with you, who's working with you, what's their role, what's the role, how are you going to engage with them, how will you scaffold their participation and support their own sharing about the project with their own organizations. You might actually develop a memorandum of understanding that lays out time commitments and roles and benefits and risks, etc., with your knowledge users. That's proved useful for lots of people, just to keep people on task, keep it clear for them what their contribution is. And you will want to think about aligning what you write here with the letters of support that you might be provided by your knowledge users. You have to think about the costs that might be incurred by working iteratively with your knowledge users over time. And then how you might evaluate the quality of that integration. So it might be some form of evaluation of partnership a partner evaluation tool or a partnership tool. There are different things out there that would help you accomplish that task. So you would start to write your IKT section here. One of the things we know about quality of knowledge translation plans, and this is sort of a recurrent theme of as I'm describing these two tools, is generally quite haphazard. So as I said, if you look at anyone's plan or even some of your own, what you may see is, okay, I actually did identify who my knowledge users or target audiences were, and I said something about strategies that I'm going to use. But if you remember all of the 13 areas of the KTPT, you'll realize there are things you left out. You weren't comprehensive because you didn't identify what's the goal. How does the strategy align with the goal? How will you know that you accomplished the goal? So there are pieces missing. The other thing that happens when you just chunk it out between users and strategies is you have no alignment. Well, ask yourself, what strategy for what purpose, for whom, and how will I know it was effective? That's what I mean by alignment. And the last thing I've noticed in people's proposals is lack of feasibility. It could be something as simple as a team proposing a very nicely fleshed out, not too bad KT plan, and there's nothing to reflect its execution in the budget. Well, the feasibility of that drops. Or something that's also common is trying to do too much with too little time or too little money or too few team members. So you really do need to think about feasibility. I developed a knowledge translation appraisal tool, and I'm sorry if it looks teeny tiny here, but please feel free to go and pick it up and have a look at it on your own. But it gives you an idea of a tool you could use to assess your own quality. So I'm diverting it here from the companion tool just to make the point about alignment and quality of KT plans. So there are questions that look at how comprehensive your plan is. Is it missing features? Is it vaguely mentioning certain features, et cetera, et cetera? How well aligned are the components of your plan and how feasible is your plan? And you could use this tool to actually evaluate your own plan or as a review committee member even to evaluate other people's KT plans within their proposal. So alignment is really important. The main messages must align with knowledge users, goals, strategies, and evaluation indicators. So align the core KT planning elements together. That's an important main message of this presentation, period. And as I pointed out, you can rate the alignment in terms of the extent to which all of the components relate to one another. The third part, coming back to the companion tool, is the end of grant KT section. So most KT plans describe knowledge users and strategies, again, without that alignment to one another. And it's difficult to think of a way to do this. And I've given you an example here on the form. It's how I do it. It's not the only way to do it, for sure. But I give you sort of an example of how you might write this. So you might type out in whatever section you have, knowledge translation will occur at the end of the grant or project. And remember, you've talked about your integrated knowledge translation in the previous paragraph. So now this is just about your end of grant activities. You would go on to say several, maybe you want to specify 1, 2, or 3 knowledge user audiences may benefit from learning about our study. Each knowledge user is described below alongside the targeted main messages, potential for benefit or KT goal, the strategies to be used, and the indicators of KT goal attainment. Required resources are described in the budget, so that's just good grantsmanship. So you can start off with, let's assume your research findings have implications for 2 different types of knowledge users, people with disabilities and funders. And you want to target them both. So you're identifying them as knowledge user number 1 and knowledge user number 2. And the thing is your project is going to identify a set of results that you can tweak them so that you're communicating the main message in a way that resonates to that particular knowledge user. And you may also have a different purpose of goal for each communication. You might have a particular purpose for the funder or for a service provider, and that purpose may be very different than what it is for the individual with disabilities who's seeking employment. Maybe that individual needs some awareness building and some knowledge, and perhaps a linkage to some templates or some tools that may help them seeking employment. The funders may need a variation on that message with a different purpose in mind, etc. And you repeat that pattern. Now, sometimes you will have pretty much the same message, pretty much the same intent or purpose, and indicators for several knowledge user audiences, in which case I would collapse them, but I've left them separate here. So what not to do? Write a paragraph that says we will involve the following knowledge users and list them, and then write another paragraph that says we will use the following KT strategies and list them. And I wish you were all in the room, because with me I would say, so what's the problem with that? And hopefully you would be able to, in unison, tell me what the problem is. So if you do this, you're missing the following. What are you planning to communicate? To whom? To which knowledge users? For what purpose? With what strategy aligned to the purpose and the knowledge user and the main message, and with what impact? So by now I hope you really understand what I mean by alignment. So I thought I would take a moment, maybe I'll pause here since I'm going rapid fire and it's only 3:23, and see if Anne has any questions in the chat that people want some clarification on. I will tell you that the next section, I'm going to take you through a retrospective application to an article. I did not look very far and wide to find an article that had to do with employment for people with disabilities, and I pretended essentially that I was the research team and tried to reverse engineer what I think their knowledge translation plan would have been, just to give you a bit of a context-specific example. And then the last part of what I have to present to you is that Anne shared with me a handful of questions that some of you had sent in previously, and I've answered those questions, so I'll address those. But let me pause, and Anne, if you can let me know if there are any questions at this point.
Well, I don't see any posted in the chat box. I want to invite everyone to post their questions in the chat box throughout the presentation today. We'll keep this as informal as possible to keep everyone engaged and ask questions when they come up. One of the questions that did come up, which I know you'll address at the end, might be relevant before we dig into this example.
Sure.
And that was, where are the best place, oh no, sorry. When should end of grant KT be used versus integrated KT?
Right. So integrated by its very definition means it's happening probably right from the proposal stage. So if you really are engaging your knowledge users, the first opportunity to do that is to engage with them as you're writing your proposal, thinking through, okay, as a researcher or an investigator, I know what I want to ask, but how relevant, how in tune is it with our knowledge users, and do they have a different spin on what they might want to know from this particular research project? And so the knowledge users have an opportunity to provide key and relevant input to the proposal writing. And then there are lots of steps, assuming you're funded, yay, and it's successful and on you go, engaging with your knowledge users in ways that really invite authentic engagement, give people an opportunity to voice their concerns, issues, and to really participate in different ways. And they can participate with recruitment, any aspect of your methods. They can participate and give their point of view with respect to intermittent review of results as they're coming in, the significance and meaning of the findings for your project, and of course, at the end, the development and refinement of what you had proposed in your proposal as a knowledge translation plan and execution of those KT activities. End of grant would be those KT activities that occur at the end. Now, you still have, if you were initially engaging with knowledge users, they're around to help you with that part of it. your partner organizations that you've engaged with might also be around to help you with aspects of creation, delivery, and dissemination of your knowledge translation deliverables. And by deliverables, I mean not just a manuscript, but it could be a webinar, it could be a 2-page summary, it could be an infographic, whatever it is you are disseminating, whatever your dissemination tool looks like, is where you can benefit from their input. I want to say that there are some instances, probably not in the kind of research you do because it's very participatory in nature and lends itself to health service sorts of questions, but there will be some instances in basic science where there's no knowledge user engagement, and that's fine. That's okay as long as it's understood and it's sort of defended as to why that's the case. So it's not necessarily a gold standard. It depends on what pillar of science you're in, what questions you're asking, and really the appropriateness of having knowledge users involved.
Right. Can you give an example of when that is appropriate in your experience?
Well, I'll give an example of when it's not, and then come
Okay.
back to an example such as this one, for instance, where it is. So you're a basic scientist. I don't know what you would be studying in terms of employment and disability as a basic scientist. Maybe someone can answer that question. But you're a basic scientist in some area of health or social, of mental health, and you might be studying something in the lab. You might be running an experiment, in which case probably the findings that you're going to come up with are going to be most useful in informing your next experiment, your next study. They're not necessarily shareable with folks at this point in the research continuum who are outside of the research sphere, right? So that would be an example where you have a much more contained knowledge translation plan. Doesn't mean you're not sharing it with anybody, but probably few and far between outside of academia. Where you might be thinking of increasing your knowledge user audience is where you're dealing with social issues such as this. If I can just morph into this particular paper, and this is not in no way am I using this paper to critique it. I'm not. I'm simply using this as an example for content. But this is about community engaged methods to adapt virtual reality job interview training for transition-age youth on the autism spectrum. So you can imagine that if you are adapting a tool, you're adapting a process, you probably want input from people, families, individuals with lived experience of autism. You may want input from organizations that support employment or support development of these individuals. You may want family member input. You may want employer input, right? So I think you get the sense of why that would be useful for this particular research focus. Anything else, Anne?
No, I think that's a great explanation. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Sure. So this is the project that I picked, and I'll just give you sort of a view of the abstract so you can, maybe you can take a few moments to read this. I can read it out loud in case there's anybody with visual difficulties, but essentially the project that was laid out here is a virtual reality job interview training that currently exists. And it's shown to be efficacious internet-based intervention for adults with severe mental illness. But now we're thinking of an adaptation to a different population. The evaluations of this virtual reality job interview training with the original population of adults with severe mental illness is the focus of this, and also extending that to individuals with autism spectrum disorders. So the job interview training trains participants about how to fill out job applications and handle job interviews through e-learning content and applied practice. And then the trainees receive feedback through in-the-moment nonverbal cues, critiques, and recommendations for improving their performance. And this particular study sought to adapt this virtual reality job interview training from its original intended audience, which is adults with severe mental illness, to transition age youth with ASD. So you know what the project's about, what you might be considering as you are developing the proposal for this project. You would be asking yourself questions such as, who would be interested or who could benefit from this research? When should you engage with them? Why and how would I engage with them? So that's, again, the timeline. Are you engaging with them early? And just because you choose to do integrated knowledge translation doesn't mean they have to be involved in the proposal, although one would wonder why they weren't, if they weren't. But there might be other reasons where you involve different types of knowledge users along the pathway of doing your research for specific purposes. What do you know about the knowledge needs of your knowledge users? What do they need to know? What do they already know? What do you know about where and how they currently access information? If you know something about that, that's going to inform your dissemination plan. What are your channels of communication? And sorry, a little typo there. What do you know about the knowledge translation methods that are effective for this population and with that particular purpose of helping them to identify a tool, use a tool for benefit, and hopefully capture whether that tool was useful for them or not. So this is starting to get at the who. So who do we need to involve here? And as you're thinking about who, you want to also be thinking about things like, when do I want to involve them? And what does that integrated knowledge translation plan look like? So as we look further into the methods of what they actually did in this study, and perhaps, remember, we're reverse engineering this, so we'd be asking ourselves, so given that that's what we want to do, we want to tailor this interview protocol to a different population, what are we going to do? So here's a description of what they did. We recruited young ASD and adult stakeholders from public and charter schools, transition programs, and community service providers. So there's a hint about, who cares about this and who needs to be involved. Participants provided feedback on the interview tool to enhance its applicability to this population. They used community-engaged methods to process and analyze data from the young adults with ASD and the stakeholders, and then they presented their quantitative and qualitative responses to community and scientific advisory boards. So that's who they did their translation to. But presumably you think they would translate also back to the community organizations that supported them along the way. So consider here, in what way was this an integrated KT approach? Who did they involve? How did they involve them? And how would that help them in their knowledge translation plan? That's what you're thinking about in the IKT. So as we look at the results of the abstract, they talk about what their adaptations included. So they added diversity to the virtual hiring manager, they shortened the interview by reducing response options, et cetera, et cetera. And then they concluded that this study was a rigorous and innovative community-engaged methodology for adapting this interview process to meet the needs of this particular population. So if you're not going to know this when you're writing your proposal, of course, because you have to sort of think this is what we hope we will be able to say. But at least retrospectively, we can identify what are the main messages here. The main messages here are adopting an interview tool to support this population was possible, that an improved and tailored implementation tool was produced. It was produced through user engagement. So this notion of user-centered design works its way through that integrated KT aspect. With some guidance on the usefulness and limitations of employing that methodology for adapting other behavioral interventions. So methodologically, they have something to say to people who might be adapting other tools for different populations. So recreating the end of grant, you would remember now you're talking about who are you engaging with, what are you telling them, why are you telling them, how are you telling them, and how will you know it was effective? So you could say our KT plan is to share results with a range of knowledge users, largely to promote awareness of our interview method among those who may benefit, and you would identify who those are. Our specific KT activities will be emergent, because you're writing in the future tense in your proposal, as per our engagement with knowledge users, and are as follows. So your first end of grant KT goal might be, we will build awareness and knowledge, that's the KT purpose, of our adapted job interview training among school counselors using whatever strategies. We will evaluate the impact of these KT strategies using the following indicators. And you would pick your indicators from a range of indicators that are listed on the KTPT, or thinking about what makes sense. What are things you can track that shows that school counselors were engaged, they got this content, they were informed, they felt compelled to use it, they thought it would be valuable, etc. And then you would go on to your end of grant knowledge translation goal number 2. So some things to be careful about as you're doing this. Not morphing from dissemination plan, which is what the knowledge translation planning template addresses, into an implementation plan. These are not the same thing, and they require different approaches. We can talk more about that if people have questions. Consider what the evidence suggests regarding effective strategies. So earlier, I made the point that you might want to look at what other knowledge translation strategies have been used with my knowledge user population, or in the context of supporting employment services and employment success amongst this particular population. Go to Campbell collaboration, go to the Cochrane collaboration, look around and see what other people are doing, because you want to use the evidence that exists for knowledge translation strategies as informing your knowledge translation plan. Because you are also planning to evaluate whether particular strategies you used met the desired goals, you're also integrating some rigor in your approach so that you will be able to say what was effective in this particular instance. And then lastly, consider the feasibility of what you're proposing. So your team composition, your time, your cost, your resources. I have a game, it's a card game that I use in my workshops called the KT game. And it's a simulation game, so people pick a scenario in a group where they're going to develop a KT plan for a particular scenario, and then they have to use the card deck sort of as manipulables to sort through what their plan is. And at the end, I have the different groups kind of give a little debrief to the room about what they have done. And the teams, the group, some groups, and it's always inevitable, will have identified like 15 different KT strategies that they're going to do, which of course might be gold standard if you had all the money in the world, all the time in the world, and the largest team and were well resourced, but that's usually not feasible. So you really kind of have to think from a grantsmanship perspective of who could you reach out to in this amount of time and accomplish, what could you actually accomplish? So remember, feasibility is important. I'm going to stop there before we get into the pre-submitted questions to see, Anne, if there are any other things that are emerging at this time.
Allow me to take a look real quick.
Okay.
And just as a reminder, anyone who's signed on a little bit late, you're welcome to ask your questions in the chat box, and we will address those to Melanie. As we'll give folks just a minute here.
Sure.
I would like to hear, in the meantime, a little bit more about your KT strategies versus the implementation strategies. I know in preparing for this webinar, I thought, let's not get into the weeds. That's a whole different training. But since it's been brought up a couple times, could you give us a real fast and dirty definitions of those for our listeners today?
Sure, and that is one of the questions in terms of the third question on the slide, where are the best places to find effective implementation strategies? So the first thing to start off with, sort of as a mental frame, is that there's dissemination, which is essentially sharing research evidence with those who might benefit from that evidence. And I talk about benefit rather than use because I'm really identifying that people can benefit from research evidence that's shared with them in a way that's non-instrumental. So people don't have to change their behavior or practice to demonstrate a benefit. They might benefit simply by understanding something they didn't understand before, feeling informed in making decisions based on evidence, improving their knowledge base, and so on. So I think of dissemination as how do we share the essential findings from research evidence with people who may benefit and demonstrate that they actually benefited. There are some instances, of course, particularly in health and health services and so on, where we want to do more than that. We want to do more than disseminate and create awareness and engagement and share knowledge or inform decision making or policy. We actually want people to use the evidence. So that's the implementation side of the coin. We want people to either change policies, change their behavior when you think about the public, or change their practices when you think about providers. And that requires its own set of strategies and processes and sort of what I call core components of implementation over and above any dissemination that you might do. So in my model that I have in the implementation game, which is a simulation game with a board game and cards and a worksheet and a facilitation guide, etc. I've taken the science of implementation, which most people will appreciate is rapidly emerging. There's a lot of information out there. It's not all in the same place. And unless you're on top of it, it's hard to figure out what you have to do to make implementation effective. And simplified all of this into 5 core components. So implementation team, implementation process, all of the factors that might facilitate or hinder that implementation process, implementation strategies, and implementation outcomes. And suffice it to say, if you can hold on to those 5 core components and understand them and be familiar with what lies beneath each one, you can develop an implementation plan. But you can see that those core components are very different than the 13 that I've outlined for the knowledge translation planning template. Implementation strategies might be things like you're looking for what strategies can you use that will mitigate particular barriers to implementation. So strategies for buy-in might be things like leadership engagement, good communication, developing communities of practice. So the best place to look, and I'll jump ahead to the yellow box here on the screen, is, well, you can look at the implementation game because they're incorporated there, but the ERIC compilation and associated papers. And I had intended to include some links there, but I can share them with Anne so that they're available to you. This is the work of Byron Powell and many of his colleagues, basically looking at a systematic review and reconceptualization of all implementation strategies and characterizing them as financial strategies, educational strategies, what else is there? Quality management strategies, and so on. And those strategies, not to get overly complicated, but those strategies really address the mechanisms of change for any factors that might be problematic for making that change happen. So I stopped there, and hopefully it didn't go way askew.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for that clarification. Our sister center, the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, has a database of KT strategies. So I'll send that along with the Byron Powell paper or ERIC compilation to the registrant so people can have that follow-up information.
What you may find, and I do not know that this is the case for the KTDRR list,
Hmm.
But when people talk about knowledge translation, what's difficult is you don't know whether they're talking about dissemination and or implementation. So
Right.
dissemination strategies might be things like a two-page summary or um, an informational video, right? They are strategies to share knowledge, to inform, to put content on web pages and so on and so forth. Implementation strategies are their own thing.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Got it.
So I'm trying not to use, I mean, I can't get rid of it now because I have such a longstanding history of using KT, but at least being clear when I talk about KT as an acronym, am I talking about dissemination or implementation?
That's right. Yeah, I think
The
we all
umbrella
got.
term. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So, and I would like to acknowledge the folks who did ask questions in the registration form. That really does help us plan our events. So, I believe some of these questions have been talked about a little bit, but I think Melanie can go through them. Oh,
Sure.
um, before we go on, we did have one question come into the chat box. Kathleen writes, I'm wondering about the question, when should end of grant KT take place versus integrated KT? I understand your question is when, if when is taken to mean at what point in time. How would you answer the question if when was taken to mean under what circumstances?
Okay. Good question. Um, I think it depends on, I think there's always end of grant. So when you, for different purposes, I think end of grant activities, knowledge translation activities, even when they're just sort of, they are dissemination, you are disseminating to your funder as an accountability purpose, right? That's always going to be need to happen. You are, as an investigator, you are disseminating to the academic community. And those are sort of the traditional ways of disseminating. I think it's now widely accepted that the sphere of whom you disseminate to needs to widen, because otherwise we have problems with accessibility and reach of our research evidence. So I think end of grant is always um, uh, useful and should take place with other knowledge users who can benefit from the research that you're sharing, whoever that might be. And it's going to be different depending on what your project is. I suppose one caveat to that would be if you did a small project that where the purpose was to inform the next project, you might not invest so heavily in knowledge translation beyond the funder. So an example of that would be, I can take an example from my own program of research. I have a very small grant from Canadian Institutes of Health Research to run a meeting. And the purpose of that meeting is to bring together a very selected, tailored group of knowledge users to have a conversation and engage in developing personas or user profiles for the digital version of the implementation game, which will become its own website. And so at the end of that meeting, what we're really producing are user personas and functionalities that are going to inform what the web designers will do to develop wireframes and visual interface and the actual tool itself. So at that point, I don't think there's a whole lot to be gained in going back to knowledge users and telling them what we identified in terms of functionalities for this projected website or who the users might be, other than in very broad strokes, maybe pre-promotion material that says, hey, this type of product is under development for you coming in the next year. We're on our way. That would be the only purpose I would see. I hope that's a useful example.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. Keeping in our time, I think we have
Yeah,
about 5 or
sure.
7 minutes left. Um, Which questions have you not answered on this list of the pre-submitted questions?
Okay, well, we've tackled the third and the fourth, I think. So I think question one, how does one effectively bridge research to practice so that what is learned can be applied to practitioners and other researchers? It's interesting because even for this makes me think of organizations and people who come into the training that I provide who say, look, I work in an organization that does a lot of dissemination. They have a sort of a knowledge translation program, but we are not mandated or equipped to support people to make practice change based on what we're telling them. And that happens a lot for advocacy organizations and different specific types of health provider organizations. I think what you can do, if that's the case, though, is scaffold good implementation practice. So say to people, here's what we learned, here's what we think applies to you, here's what you might consider doing differently. And in doing so, here is some implementation guidance or considerations or links to people who can help you do that, right? So don't just drop them cold with, hey, here's the information, have fun with it. Do that, share the information, but then give them some indication about what it's going to take to make some changes in their organization and build that. And that builds into your implementation plan if you're actually going to further your work and go in that direction. Question two, how do I move from planning to template? Well, I use the companion tool. I actually do. And so that's really its purpose. What's the best practice for reviewing and updating your KT plan? I think you can review post-funding confirmation to make sure it aligns with the allocated budget. So let's say you planned, you sent in your proposal, you got a notice of a decision, you were successful. Depending on who your funder is, you may or may not get the money that you asked for. You need to probably do some rejigging of both your methodology and your KT methodology and plan once you know. And then the second answer is to build the KT plan review into your research project meetings. So as you meet with your team and you're conducting your research, you should also occasionally be coming back and reviewing your knowledge translation activities and how are they shaping up and what are you going to need. And it's part of your general project plan management. And then who else is using the companion tool? I don't know, because I'm not tracking that. So that's a missed opportunity for me at the moment. But, you will see that when you download the tool from the Sick Kids website or my website, any of the tools, we do ask people to let us know who they are in terms of their email addresses and whether they consent to being contacted, with the purpose of eventually going back to people and saying, hey, you had this tool, how did you use it? Was it effective? So that's a follow-up for us. And I'll stop there.
Well, yes, thank you once again, Melanie. Every hour I spend with you, it goes by in a blur. There's so much information I'm learning. So I appreciate that. And I hope that all of our participants got so much out of this webinar as I did. I would love to invite you all to fill out the evaluation, this brief evaluation. It just should take about 5 or 10 minutes, and let us know how we did. And if there's any other information that you would like to have from the Cater Center, please fill that out as well. We definitely do take time to read these evaluation results. And if you are a NIDLR employment grantee and interested in working with us on the companion tool with your KT plan, of course, please contact me today. It looked like earlier in the chat box, our project director, Kathleen Murphy, put in her direct line, so you can call her or you can email me, and we'll definitely get you connected. We have 2 more spots available for people to actually go through the companion tool, and we'll use these examples on our website for fellow grantees to know how to use this. But if you would like technical assistance in this area, regardless, please feel free to get in touch with us. And without further ado, you can contact us by emailing us at cater@air.org or any of us directly. And of course, thank you, Melanie, once again for your time this afternoon. And thank you to Ariana and Shoshana for their support for today's webinar. And finally, thank you to Neidler for providing support for this webinar and all of our center's activities. So thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.